Welcome to another quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history. If you're here to relax, wind down, or drift into sleep with something gentle and strange, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're returning to the Middle Ages, not the wars or kings or castles, but the quieter fears. The things people never wrote down, but always remembered. That we're exploring why medieval people avoided mirrors and still water indoors. Not because they didn't understand reflection, but because they did. And what they understood wasn't always comfortable. So take a deep breath. Settle in. And let's begin. Asterisk in the Middle Ages, people lived close to nature, to silence, and to the dark. Candles were a luxury. Sunlight was a visitor. Shadows moved freely, and homes, if you could call them that, were made of uneven wood, packed earth, and flickering shapes on walls. That a reflection was not something they saw often. There were no glass mirrors like we know today. What they had were small polished pieces of metal, often bronze or tin, dull, blurry, and warped, rarely owned, usually handheld, and almost never brought indoors unless you had good reason. Reflections were fragile, fickle. They moved even when you didn't. But what unnerved people wasn't just the technology. It was what they believed a reflection meant. That to look into a mirror was to look into something between worlds. It wasn't just your face staring back. It was you, without warmth, without breath, without soul. A double, a quiet echo. And in many stories passed down by quiet firesides, that echo didn't always stay where it belonged. Still water was even more dangerous. The bowl of water indoors could show your face clearly if the light hit it right. But unlike a mirror, water moved. It trembled. It could be disturbed by nothing visible. Many believed that if your reflection rippled when you were still, someone or something was with you. Unseen. In the countryside, where oral tradition ruled and literacy was rare, stories about reflections weren't told in books. They were murmured warnings from grandmothers, shared by midwives, whispered between children who'd seen something they couldn't explain. Stories of people whose reflections smiled when they didn't, of surfaces that showed something behind you when you were alone. Even in churches, mirrors were suspect. In some cases, they were banned altogether. Monasteries, places of silence, repetition, prayer, had little use for self-inspection. It was vanity, or worse, a distraction from spiritual work, a temptation to pride, a doorway for the ego to slip in. And in certain corners of Europe, especially in cold, damp regions where folklore clung like moss, people genuinely believed that looking at yourself too long could summon attention. Not yours, not earthly. Why did this fear settle so deeply? Because in a world with so few clear surfaces, anything that could imitate you had power. People feared things that mirrored the real world too well, because they weren't part of the real world. Dreams, for example, were to be remembered and interpreted, but not trusted. Paintings were to be viewed and blessed, but not stared at in silence. Reflections were different. They were temporary, and sometimes uninvited. Still water in particular took on meaning during sleep. It was common for people to cover water bowls at night, not for sanitation, but for protection. It was believed that your soul might wander during dreams, and in some cases, could become trapped in a reflective surface. To wake and see your face in water before your soul returned was, in some stories, fatal. Or worse, it might bring something back with you. People avoided reflections indoors, not always out of fear, sometimes out of respect, and sometimes just out of tradition. Even modern scholars, those who've sifted through records, letters, household inventories, note the absence of reflective objects in medieval interiors, not just in the homes of peasants, but in manor houses, even castles. You'll find combs, candles, cups, but rarely mirrors. And when you do, they're often listed with religious objects or as part of medicine chests, because in many minds, the only people who needed mirrors were healers or witches, And even they kept them covered when not in US.so. Imagine it that you're living in a one-room cottage in 1270. The floor is dirt. The air smells like smoke and wool and warm bread. A wooden bowl of water sits near the window, but you don't look into it at night. Your mother once told you why, but she never explained it twice that you've never seen your whole reflection at once. Only fragments. A quick glance in a burnished plate. A glimpse in a puddle. A shadow in glass. And you prefer it that way because the person who watches back doesn't always blink when you do. In medieval Europe, the inside of a house was more than shelter. It was protection, not just from wind or animals or strangers, but from attention. Attention from the outside, from the dark, from things people couldn't quite name. Reflections were a special concern. Homes were simple. Most had one room. Stone if you were lucky, thatch if you were not. The windows were small, without glass, often covered by cloth, hide, or thin oiled paper. Light was rare, and surfaces that could reflect it, rarer still. This wasn't because people didn't understand mirrors. It's that they didn't trust them. Not openly, of course. No one would say it directly. But watch a person prepare. A room for nightfall, and you would understand. Every action had its place. The same motion every evening, with no explanation, because none was needed. Start with water. Most homes had a large wooden or clay basin near the hearth, used for washing hands, vegetables, wounds. In the day, it sat uncovered. But at dusk, someone, a mother, a daughter, sometimes the oldest child, would cover it. With what? A square of linen, a round wooden disc, a loaf of crusty bread, a thin sheet of slate if the family owned one. Why? No one would answer directly. It's not good to see yourself after dark, some would say. You don't want to. Wake to a face you don't recognize. Others whispered if water was left uncovered by mistake, and someone glimpsed themselves at the wrong moment, especially near dawn or during a storm. They might fall quiet for the rest of the day. Not because they saw anything terrible, but because they expected to. That anticipation, the breathless wait for something to happen, was often enough. Children were taught not to play near water indoors. A toddler gazing too long into a bucket might be gently pulled away, even scolded. Not harshly, just enough to redirect. The lesson wasn't fear. It was prevention. And what about actual mirrors? Highly polished metal mirrors, usually bronze, sometimes tin or silverback glass in wealthier homes, were rare. Too expensive for most. But when present, they were never displayed casually. You wouldn't see one hanging in a main room. You wouldn't catch your reflection walking by. Instead, they were stored face down, wrapped in cloth, placed in drawers, hidden behind other items if someone needed a mirror for grooming, medicine, or cleaning a wound. They used it, then immediately turned it away. Always away. And at night, never left face up, not even under cloth. The mirror had to be turned so its surface touched something solid. A table, a stone shelf, the floor. Reflections don't rest well on open air, people said. And iron. Let's talk about iron. There was a belief, especially in colder regions, that a piece of iron placed beside or inside a water bowl at night would hold the reflection in place. A knife, a nail, a spoon. It didn't matter what kind, just something solid, man-shaped, and cold. People said iron was too dense for tricks. It didn't shimmer. It didn't echo. If you placed a knife in the bowl, whatever tried to. Look back would think twice. Sometimes a flat stone would be added too. Something unpolished, uncarved. Plain. As if the combination of earth and iron could press down whatever floated too high. These were not dramatic rituals. There were no candles, no chanting, no formal words. Just small actions, done the same way every night. If a guest forgot and left a water jug uncovered, someone else would quietly fix it. If a mirror sat face up, someone would reach over, not scolding, not explaining, just turning, and the explanations, when they came, were vague. You don't want it catching anything. It's not good to leave your shape wandering. Water holds things longer than it should. Even windows were arranged to avoid too much reflection. A bowl of water wasn't placed directly across from a window. A mirror was never near a doorway. In some areas, people even placed a sprig of dried herbs near their water overnight, not for health, but to cloud the surface. In rare households, where paintings existed, usually of family members or protective symbols, they too were sometimes turned to the wall during storms or funerals. Again, no reason given, just to give the image time to rest. The truth is, reflections were never seen as simply light. They were something between matter and memory. Not quite a shadow, not quite a spirit, a visual echo. And echoes were known to repeat when they shouldn't, that if your reflection smiled back when you were frowning, if it stayed after you turned away, if it blinked 1 second late. These were not stories people wrote down, but they told them, quietly, repeatedly, enough that generations changed how they handled water, metal, glass, not because they feared death, but because they didn't want to invite anything in. And the scariest thing? These weren't stories of monsters or curses. These were stories without endings. Nothing dramatic happened, just discomfort. A dog wouldn't go near the mirror for a week. Someone started sleepwalking after drinking from the wrong bowl. The baby wouldn't stop crying near the water jug.so people adjusted a folded cloth, a spoon, a turned surface, a closed shutter, and when asked why, they would only shrug and say, just to be safe. In times of vulnerability, sickness, sleep, and death, medieval households treated reflections with special caution. This was not just tradition, it was a quiet, unspoken defense. The belief wasn't that a mirror would cause harm, but that, in moments of physical or spiritual weakness, reflections became unpredictable. The mirror became something you turned away from, not because it did something, but because you couldn't afford to be noticed. Take the sickbed. When someone fell ill, particularly with a fever, mirrors and standing water were deliberately removed from the room. If they couldn't be removed, they were covered. Not covered lightly, but with thick cloth, even stacked with books or bowls. The idea was to prevent the reflection of the sick person from slipping out, a phrase used in several local traditions. Across Central and Northern Europe, this wasn't spiritual or superstitious in a loud way. It wasn't about possession or ghosts. It was about a kind of practical, visual boundary. Medieval people understood that what you saw had weight. A reflection, seen at the wrong time, could disturb the already fragile balance of health and rest. There are accounts in rural Welsh folklore, for example, where a person with typhoid or sweating sickness was kept in complete darkness, with all bowls emptied and turned upside down. When asked why, the explanation was, she's already between places. Let's not give her a way to leave. More than once, midwives and elder women would insist that no reflective surfaces be present during childbirth either, not because of fear, but because birth was a liminal space, an edge, a crossing. If a mirror was present, especially one showing the mother's face, it was considered risky. You don't watch yourself be born, one midwife reportedly said, brushing a mirror off a table as if it were a pest. Even animals played into these customs. Dogs and cats, common in many homes, were watched closely. If they stared too long at a mirror or bowl of water, especially when someone in the household was unwell, the object was removed. Animals were believed to see more than humans, and their discomfort was a cue to act, not question. Death was the most serious moment of all. When someone passed away, it was standard practice in many regions to cover all reflective surfaces in the home, not just in the room where the person died, but throughout the entire building. This practice endured well into the 19th century, often mistaken as purely symbolic mourning. But its roots are deeper, older. The cloth didn't just signal grief. It was meant to prevent the soul, essence, or final breath of the departed from being caught or scattered. Again, this wasn't a dramatic belief. No one expected ghosts to fly out of mirrors. They just didn't want anything unfinished to reflect back. The reflection was seen as a door, not open, but never fully shut. There are records from early monastic writings in Germany describing this phenomenon in a surprisingly practical tone. One monk, writing around 1250, noted, "When Brother Edhelm passed, Sister Emma turned the water jar downward and laid cloth over the glass. Not out of fear. She only said, 'Let him pass cleanly.'" What's most telling is that these rituals persisted regardless of wealth or region. In noble homes with silver-backed mirrors and decorative basins, the rules were the same. Tapestries were draped over frames. Water jugs were emptied. Servants were instructed to sweep away reflections. Not dirt, not dust, but light. And for those who died alone, or suddenly, the house itself was sometimes considered reflective. People would avoid certain corridors, windows, or rooms for weeks. Not because anything visibly changed, but because something had been seen. A glimpse, a motion, the shadow of someone who wasn't there. And with no way to confirm it, the only option was to avoid. You see, this was a culture that didn't need proof to act. It needed rhythm, repetition, small rules, everyday barriers between what was seen and what was not, between the healthy and the sick, the living and the dead, the present and the reflected. In that way, the medieval home was never still, not even when it was quiet. Every bowl, mirror, and polished cup was watched, then turned. Every shadow near water was noticed, then covered, and when asked why, even centuries later, the answer remained the same. Because when you are weak, your reflection remembers more than it should. While mirrors drew the eye with their shine and clarity, it was the water basin that lingered longer in memory. Still, motionless and ordinary, it was one of the most quietly respected objects in the medieval household. Not for its use, everyone needed water, but for the way it stayed quiet when you stared into it too long. Basins, buckets, even clean puddles on the stone floor had a rule: don't leave them uncovered at night. Especially indoors, especially near a bed. Unlike a mirror, which had an edge, a boundary, a reflection in water was borderless. It could warp, ripple, and reform. It moved when you didn't. If you walked past and caught your face in a bucket, even if only for a second, it could feel like something had seen you from the other side. In abbeys and small manor houses, it was common practice to overturn or empty water vessels at sundown. Not because water would go bad, that concern came later, but because sleeping near standing water felt exposed. Women scrubbing cloth at dusk would often drain the last bowl hastily, sometimes tipping it away from themselves without looking down. The superstitions, if we must call them that, were never shouted or written in official rules. They were passed, quietly, one woman to another, one apprentice to the next. A housemaid might whisper, "Never leave the washbowl in the child's room overnight." When asked why, she'd only say, "It sees them when they sleep." Several travel journals from the 15th century mention that inns in southern France and parts of Italy removed all water vessels from guest rooms after dark. One curious visitor asked about it and was told with a shrug, "Some guests sleep too lightly. They wake and talk to things they shouldn't." The idea wasn't demonic. It wasn't dramatic. It was observational. People noticed that when someone was ill or distressed, they would sometimes speak toward the basin, or avoid it, or flip it without thinking. When asked, they'd only say, "I thought I saw someone." And then there were children. Children in medieval homes were particularly shielded from reflections in water. It was common in northern villages to teach kids not to look into wells too long, not because of danger of falling, but because of stories. Stories where faces looked back. Stories where a child began to speak to a double, not in fear, but with eerie familiarity. Not all regions treated these stories as dangerous. Some, like parts of Bohemia and Bavaria, treated them as something between a ritual and a routine. A mother might warn her child, Don't leave your wash basin full tonight, love. If the water remembers you, you'll wake up tired. This phrase, the water remembers you, was written into at least 2 household journals found in early 14th century estates. It wasn't a curse. It was a note of caution. Water that remembers is water that notices. And medieval people, practical as they were, had no interest in being noticed by something they couldn't explain. That what's striking is how mundane these practices were. You wouldn't see villagers in cloaks chanting around a pool. You'd just see someone tip over a bowl with practiced nonchalance. You'd see the last water poured out the window. You'd see a basin placed upside down on the hearth as if it were just another chore. No words, no drama, just rhythm. Over time, these habits became invisible. Tourists from other regions would sometimes ask why a home had no water ready in the morning. The answer? We don't let the dark see itself. So, while mirrors were dramatic in literature, it was water that held the daily, silent power. Water that moved without reason. Water that stilled without invitation. Water that watched. And in homes where people lived close to death, close to birth, and close to sleep, the safest water was water turned over, covered, or gone, because still water doesn't sleep. And medieval people knew it might be still, but it is never empty. In medieval homes, the day ended long before the stars were fully out. Not because people were particularly fearful, but because their world was structured by light and sound. A candle's flicker could only reach so far. A voice carried just a room or two. Beyond that, things became uncertain. Not necessarily dangerous, but unclear, unreliable. And among the many unspoken rules that governed life once darkness fell, there was one repeated in dozens of villages, abbeys, and keeps. Alike, never leave a door unlatched at night. That it wasn't only about physical safety. Of course, there were the obvious risks: thieves, stray dogs, wild men, the occasional criminal seeking shelter. But even in locked communities or rural homes where no one could possibly intrude, the rule held. Doors must not be left ajar. They must not creak. They must not shift in the wind. Because in the quiet of night, anything that moved without reason was noticed. And anything noticed might begin to seem intentional. In households across what is now Belgium and Western Germany, there are recorded phrases passed from mothers to daughters. A door that moves in the dark does not move alone. It wasn't said with fear, but with finality. And so, as night approached, families did more than bolt their doors. They wedged them, weighted them. In some cases, they looped belts or ropes around the handle and tied it to the leg of a heavy table. Not out of panic, but out of habit that a creaking hinge could unsettle a whole household. One chronicler from a 14th century nunnery near York noted that an old kitchen door, once it began to whine open on its own in strong wind, was removed and replaced within 2 days. It made Sister Heloise look twice into the empty hall, she wrote. Twice was too many. This attitude toward doors extended even to furniture. Cupboards, chests, storage benches, anything with a lid or panel was kept closed after sundown. If it could open, it should be fastened. If it couldn't be fastened, it should at least be leaned against something that made opening inconvenient. But the main concern was always the entryways. The doors to rooms, the doors to cellars, the doors to sheds. Especially sheds that in numerous. Village records from Scandinavia to Brittany. Small agricultural communities developed elaborate routines for how doors were to be secured at night. One particularly detailed example from a Swedish parish inventory in the late 1200s describes how barns and grain sheds had their doors barred with not just latches, but crisscrossed beams. These beams weren't structural, they were symbolic. They were meant to signal completion. The day's work was done. The inside should stay in. The outside should stay out. This closing ritual was sometimes communal. In larger households, the senior servant or steward would walk the perimeter and perform what was sometimes called the silence turn. It meant checking each door, confirming no drape or curtain was rustling, no latch left leaning. And after this final round, everyone was expected to stay in their rooms unless summoned. It wasn't just etiquette, it was rhythm. Night belonged to stillness. But why so much attention to doors? It comes down to what doors represented. Unlike walls, which were solid and certain, or windows, which were small and usually shuttered with wood or cloth, doors were choice. They were made to be used. And in a time when choice was rare, when most people lived within strict routines and physical limitations, anything that chose to move on its own was suspicious. In the folklore of Eastern France, there's a recurring motif of the inviting door. A door that swings slightly open, not fully, not obviously, but just enough to catch the eye. The story usually goes like this. Someone rises in the night, sees a door ajar, and decides to close it. But as they approach, the door moves, either opening wider or closing just before they touch it. The next morning, they wake up tired, listless, disoriented. The implication isn't that something attacked them, but that something noticed them. To modern minds, this may sound eerie or suggestive of ghosts or malevolent forces, but medieval interpretations were quieter. They didn't jump to conclusions. They simply observed that people who disturbed night thresholds often didn't sleep well, or began speaking of odd dreams, or heard things in the beams of the house they'd never noticed before. Architecturally, this translated into smaller, thicker doors, lower thresholds, handles placed at odd heights to avoid casual movement. In some older manors and city homes, there are even records of night wedges, wedges made of wood or stone, placed under internal doors specifically for nighttime use. These were different from daytime props, heavier, often painted black, or carved with patterns that discouraged touch. The aversion to doors being open at night also intersected with seasonal changes. In spring and summer, when warmth invited windows and doors to be opened during the day, the act of closing everything at dusk became even more intentional. It was a reminder, a return to boundary. One English farmer's household journal from 1324 records. The sun lingers now, but the latch must not. Interestingly, even churches, buildings meant to be open, welcoming, respected this habit. While abbeys and chapels often hosted nighttime prayers, the doors to side chambers, vestries, and storerooms were rigorously sealed, not for fear of theft, but because clergy believed in protecting the internal stillness of the space. One prior in Ghent is quoted as saying, "An unlatched door in darkness gives too much permission." All of this points to a broader truth about medieval daily life. It was governed as much by unspoken consensus as by law or superstition. Doors were simply one part of that. Their behavior, whether they stayed shut, creaked, or moved, was a reflection of the household's discipline. A door left swinging meant someone hadn't done their part. And in an age when people depended deeply on one another, even small neglects felt significant. So, night after night, across countless villages, homes, and halls, the pattern repeated. Latch the door, brace it, test it, step away. Not because something terrible would happen if you didn't, but because something might, and that slim uncertainty was enough. Because in the still hours of the medieval night, you didn't need to believe in spirits to fear a creaking door. You only needed to hear it open when no one was there. In a medieval household, stillness wasn't just the absence of movement. It was a state of safety, a space in which nothing uninvited stirred, no light flickered without reason, and, perhaps most importantly, no reflections appeared where they shouldn't. Reflections were not considered mystical in the way modern fantasy sometimes paints them. Rather, they were seen as excessive, unnecessary, and unnecessary things in a tightly ordered world made people uncomfortable. A still surface, be it water, polished metal, or the faint gleam of a burnished pewter cup, had the capacity to reflect. But to reflect what? That question, though rarely asked aloud, hovered uncomfortably in the minds of those who observed their surroundings closely. And medieval people did observe. Their world was full of signs, and meaning was often drawn from small, repeated phenomena. Let's begin with the practical. Most medieval people rarely, if ever, saw themselves clearly. There were no glass mirrors in rural homes. At most, someone might catch a blurred outline in a bowl of still water, or see their shadow flicker on a smooth plate as candlelight danced across it. These glimpses weren't often sought. In fact, many households developed subtle habits to avoid them. Water in pitchers was left covered, not just to keep out dust or insects, but to reduce surface reflection. Metal dishes were stacked upside down. Even some finely made cups or ewers were stored in cloth once cleaned. Not because anyone feared them directly, but because reflections, when they appeared unexpectedly, pulled focus. They broke stillness, and breaking stillness, especially indoors and after sundown, was quietly discouraged. In family settings, parents taught children not to stare at bowls of water or into dark windows after dusk. Eyes find what they're told to look for. One phrase went scribbled in the margin of a 14th century housekeeping journal. This wasn't paranoia. It was social rhythm. To seek too closely, to watch too long, especially when nothing was expected to happen, made others uneasy. Imagine a stone cottage, fire embers glowing low, the hour silent, and a child staring quietly into a darkened bucket near the hearth. No movement, no sound, just waiting. That kind of behavior wasn't seen as eerie. It was seen as disruptive, as drawing something into the room that didn't belong there. This didn't mean that people avoided water or polished objects entirely. Of course not. They washed, they drank, they prepared meals, they cleaned. But they did so with motion and purpose. And when those tasks ended, the tools were returned to stillness. Cloths were placed over basins. Cups were turned over. Even polished buckles or belt clasps were tucked out of sight. The night, above all, was a time for stillness. And stillness didn't just mean quiet. It meant that objects were at rest, that nothing reflected unless you chose to make it reflect. And choosing to make something reflect, especially for no reason, was rarely done. In the rare cases where reflection was necessary, such as when noble women checked their appearance using small metal mirrors, or when a physician inspected a wound using the gleam of light off a blade. These acts were done quickly and usually in the company of others. Reflection, when it had a purpose, was accepted. When it appeared without one, it drew suspicion. Over time, this became part of a larger behavioral pattern. Avoid unnecessary noticing. To notice too much in medieval communities was often associated with social anxiety. It suggested restlessness, distrust, perhaps even a disconnection from your place in the order of things. A well-ordered home didn't just mean clean floors or well-kept animals. It meant that everyone knew what to see and what not to see. A glint in the corner of one's eye that pulled your attention away from the hearth. That was noted and quietly dismissed. Let the glint pass, they said. Eyes are made for light, not chasing. Even in spiritual contexts, which we won't go into here, the emphasis was not on the reflection itself, but on what it might distract you from. Looking too long at your own face, or seeing a shape move behind you in the surface of water was not encouraged, not feared necessarily, but gently discouraged. This silent avoidance seeped into the architecture and material culture. Wall hangings were designed not just for insulation, but to absorb light. Water was kept in darker containers. Highly polished objects were used outside, in the open air, not indoors under flickering firelight. It was simply easier that way. Safer, in the psychological sense. The culture of stillness wasn't about punishment or superstition. It was about preserving order, maintaining a space where nothing appeared that didn't belong, where a still room stayed still. And if you happened to see your own blurred face in the water as you filled a cup late at night, well, that was just water. But best not to look again. Not twice, not after dark. In the medieval household, the distinction between stillness and motion wasn't simply a matter of physics. It was a matter of familiarity, of knowing where attention belonged. Still water indoors was treated carefully, avoided when not necessary, and almost never left exposed after dark. But moving water, rippling, bubbling, flowing, was different. It was alive, predictable, less prone to surprise. That to understand this difference, we have to return to how medieval people experienced water, especially inside their homes. Most homes didn't have running water. The very concept of water running through a house was foreign until much later. Instead, water arrived in vessels, carried in from wells, rivers, springs, or communal barrels. Once inside, it was contained in pitchers, bowls, basins, or buckets. And while these containers were functional, once water sat too long, it gained a new presence. It washed back, or so some thought. You see, people trusted water more when it moved, when it gurgled in a spring or swirled in a ladle. Flowing water had a clear direction. It made noise. It caught light unevenly. There was no hiding in it. But a silent, still bowl of water on a table after nightfall, that drew glances. It created the same kind of quiet attention that an open door might. You didn't expect it to do anything, but if it did, you'd blame yourself for not covering it. Interestingly, when water had to remain indoors overnight, say, for washing in the early morning or soaking something overnight, households had subtle ways of keeping it moving. Some would stir it gently before walking away. Others left a wooden spoon resting just beneath the surface, causing occasional ripples when the wood expanded or contracted in the night's coolness. These weren't conscious rituals. They were habits, passed down by watching others. Without explanation, children who stared too long into water were redirected. Drink or clean, but don't wait, one farm wife told her daughter, according to a 14th century Flemish diary. Staring at unmoving water was a form of inaction, and inaction during night hours, when every person and object had its place, was discouraged. Interestingly, moving water wasn't just tolerated, it was sometimes invited. In more affluent homes, small indoor fountains or channels were designed to trickle water during the day. The movement was calming, distracting in a useful way. In kitchens, it masked other sounds. In courtyards, it drew attention away from still shadows. Even in some monasteries, tiny rivulets were constructed along the floor of the washing areas to keep water flowing just enough to prevent complete silence. Motion meant presence. Something was functioning. Stillness, especially from something fluid and usually active, meant it had been abandoned, or worse, forgotten. There were also practical reasons for preferring movement. Stagnant water could attract pests or grow unpleasant smells, particularly in warmer months. But beyond the hygiene, there was a subtle aesthetic discomfort. People reported feeling watched, or feeling like the water was hiding something when it didn't ripple. It wasn't about belief, it was about experience. What did you see out of the corner of your eye when walking past a quiet bucket? A trick of light, or something not quite yours? Even animals responded differently. Cats avoided staring into still bowls unless drinking. Dogs, especially when young, sometimes barked at uncovered wash basins. One chronicler from northern Italy wrote in 1318 that his family's sheepdog would not rest until the basin was tipped, as if it suspected a presence within. A small note, possibly an exaggeration, but one that matched a common sentiment. In this environment, people learned to associate motion with safety. When something moved, it could be seen, heard, and predicted. A swaying curtain meant a breeze. A crackling fire meant warmth. A trickling jug meant normality. But something that should be still and wasn't, or something that stayed still too long, that interrupted the accepted pattern of a quiet night. Thus, water left out at night was often poured away before sleep, or covered, or placed in dark corners. Anything to keep its surface out of sight. anything to return the home to visual stillness. But a ladle full of water drawn in the early morning, steaming faintly, swirling gently in a cup, that was safe. That belonged, because it moved. It lived. And it didn't ask for more attention than it deserved. So the pattern continued, household to household. Don't look into still water. Keep it moving if you must keep it. Pour it out if you can. And, above all, don't let it catch the light after everyone has gone quiet. Because the only thing worse than seeing your own reflection after dark was seeing something else behind it. In the stone manor homes of 13th century Burgundy, guests were often greeted with a faint scent of damp straw and cooling tallow. If they arrived after sunset, there might be a lantern flickering near the door, just enough to see a step or a turning handle. But inside, as shoes were wiped on woven mats or reed bundles, one object almost always sat quietly in the background: a basin, usually shallow, bronze or ceramic, sometimes resting in a niche beside the hearth or along an entranceway wall. Its purpose was practical, or at least that's what the ledgers and inventory scrolls would later suggest. One washing bowl, wide, copper-lined. One visitor's basin. Rain basin for the hearth room. Simple items, but they held a reputation their names never mentioned, because no one ever really used them. Not when anyone was looking. The water left behind, what made still water indoors so quietly unsettling was not that it was inherently dangerous, but that it invited a kind of unease that couldn't quite be explained. Outdoors, water had motion. It came from streams, rain barrels, rivers, and wells. Even in the smallest pools or puddles, there was a certainty about its presence, something natural, something placed by the world. But inside, water wasn't where it was meant to be. Indoors, especially in a time when most floors were dry-packed earth or uneven wood, water had to be carried, poured, held. And when it was left to sit in bowls or basins without clear reason, it began to take on an uncanny presence. Something left, something stilled, something that watched. There are dozens of recorded folk practices regarding indoor water during the High Middle Ages. In parts of Flanders, it was said that leaving uncovered water overnight could cause children to speak in their sleep, or worse, to remember dreams that weren't theirs. In some parts of Wales, water left in bowls after sundown had to be tossed outside before dawn, or else it would keep its image too long. The phrase, "keep its image," appears more than once in these references. It implies a belief that water did more than reflect. It held, that it remembered. This idea wasn't rooted in formal doctrine. It wasn't written in church texts or debated in guild halls. It lived in whispers, in glances, in hesitations. Someone would lean over to drop a piece of lavender in a bowl to scent the room, see their own face for a moment, and stop. Not afraid, just aware. Aware that their face was being returned to them. Not shown, returned. Rituals of ignoring by the 14th century, in areas where household order was strictly maintained, like convents, universities, and manors, records, show an unusual consistency. Bowls of water were kept covered after dusk, not emptied, not removed, covered, often with cloth, sometimes with a wooden lid. In one priory in northern Italy, a record notes, the wash bowl in the eastern corridor is not to be seen uncovered after evening song. No explanation is offered, no superstition recorded, just an instruction as practical and matter-of-fact as do not leave the bread out. And yet, it points to something deeper. It suggests that the people living in these places, while not necessarily believing in spirits or omens, recognized a kind of social tension in reflective water. One abbey in Kent even issued seasonal guidelines. During Lent and Advent, the silver basin near the guest's hall shall be emptied nightly. None shall look upon its contents after the tolling of the second bell. This was a space that welcomed strangers. Reflection, perhaps, was best left avoided when the faces in the room weren't familiar. There were, too, subtle ways of avoiding without admitting to it. Servants would carry bowls at a tilt, always keeping the surface moving. Children were taught to cup their hands over the water before pouring it out, not to see what floated, not to catch a glint of anything unexpected. In rural homes, a basin might be used in the morning to catch water from a ladle, but if it was not emptied by mid-afternoon, it would often be moved to the threshold or near the hearth, where its surface was disturbed by warmth or foot traffic. Still water in the center of a quiet room, especially one lit only by firelight or candles, was a quiet provocation, a test no one wanted to take. The unease of inward gazes, but why? What was it about water that made it different from mirrors, especially? Since actual glass mirrors were rare and heavily polished metal ones even rarer, the answer may lie in the direction of the gaze. A polished bronze mirror showed your face from a known angle. You expected distortion. You anticipated a flattened world. But water gave the illusion of depth. It suggested a surface and something beneath it. When people looked into still water, especially in dim light, their minds were not confronted with clarity. They were confronted with uncertainty. In colder months, when daylight was scarce and interiors were lit primarily by flickering flames, the reflections in bowls or basins changed constantly. A reflection might seem to move when no one did. A glint might appear where no metal lay. Some claimed to see the outlines of doorways in reflections when no door was behind them. Stories circulated, not widely, not in taverns or sermons, but in kitchens, in quiet walks from barn to house, in bedtime warnings whispered by one sibling to another. Don't leave water in the basin. She might see you. Who is she? No one quite said. Sometimes a lady of the manor long gone. Sometimes the old one, or the washer. Vague terms that didn't demand questioning, only obedience. Even in cities, where plumbing slowly emerged in monasteries and guild halls, the idea persisted. One scribe in Lubeck noted in the margin of a psalter, "The hallway bowl ripples and no wind." He did not elaborate. He did not explain. He simply moved on to the next psalm. Stillness as breach to understand the dread that medieval people associated with unused water. One must look beyond the practical and the supernatural alike. It was about boundaries. Indoor spaces were places of intention. You brought in what was needed. You used what had a purpose. Anything idle was suspect. Water that wasn't in use crossed that line. It was something meant for action, drinking, cooking, washing. To leave it still was to let it become something else. Something contemplative. Something watching back. And in a time when the interior world was carefully managed, not just in chores and order, but in thought and speech, that kind of presence felt like a breach. Some chroniclers linked indoor water with illness. Not because of germs, which they did not know, but because of miasma, bad air. But others, more quietly, suggested that it wasn't the air that carried danger. It was the silence. A silent basin in a silent room was a kind of mirror without context. A flat thing, a calm thing, too calm for its surroundings, which is why, in so many homes, it was better to move it, cover it, or simply pour it out. Because silence in water is different from silence in air. One echoes, the other absorbs. And in medieval minds, what was absorbed might not be given back clean. By the late Middle Ages, a curious pattern began appearing in wealthier European households. Polished metal mirrors were kept wrapped, sometimes in linen, sometimes in wool, often bound in ribbon and placed on a shelf. Not because they were precious, though they were, but because people simply didn't want to see themselves in them unless it was absolutely necessary. Especially not at night. In regions like Lombardy and the Rhineland, mirror coverings were stitched with deliberate symbols, geometric lines, half-crosses, spirals. These weren't religious icons or protection marks. They were reminders. Do not uncover this casually. In inventory records from a merchant home in Mainz, one mirror is described not only by its frame, but also by the note. Cover must be kept tied after twilight. Why? Not because mirrors were thought to bring bad luck in the way we understand it now. There were no widely known curses, no tales of broken glass summoning doom. But there was a quiet understanding that mirrors changed what was seen, and perhaps, more unsettlingly, when it was seen, a second look that lasted too long. The unease wasn't just about catching a glimpse of oneself. It was about seeing something else, or rather, seeing the same room, the same posture, the same candle, but with a slight delay. A moment's lag between movement and reflection. An eye blinked too late. A shadow returned too slow. Dozens of household journals and scribbled marginalia in monastic manuscripts refer to this phenomenon obliquely. The silver glass showed my taper twice, wrote a servant in 1362. Another left a note in an estate ledger. The lady's mirror does not sleep when we do. In many cases, this odd disquiet around mirrors at night wasn't addressed directly. Instead, it was managed through routine. Mirrors were draped, turned inward, tilted toward walls. If they couldn't be stored out of view, they were left in corners that received no light, especially not candlelight. The flickering of flame across a warped metal surface didn't just distort a face. It made the room seem wrong, like a memory replayed with subtle differences. Some blamed this feeling on exhaustion, others on wandering humors or bad dreams. But in private, especially among women who tended the bedrooms and hallways of noble homes, there was a stronger belief. Reflections could attract notice, not ghosts, not spirits, just attention. The mirror as an uninvited witness among textile guilds in Paris. There was a superstition that mirrors kept the day inside them. A strange phrase, but it points to a very medieval anxiety that an object capable of showing the world might also store it. Several 14th century dressing mirrors from Burgundy and Savoy were constructed with wooden shutters built directly into the frame. These weren't for protection from damage. They were there to hide the mirror itself, some even locked with small iron clasps. One chronicler noted of a wealthy chambermaid. She feared to see herself after supper, not because she was ashamed, but because she believed a nighttime reflection might draw her double, a term which, though vague, pops up in several household records and letters. It didn't necessarily mean death or possession, more like being watched twice, once by the mirror, once by something inside it. There was also the common medieval belief that windows and mirrors were cousins, that one looked out and the other looked in. But while windows faced nature, light, and weather, mirrors looked only at people. And people were fallible, secretive, full of internal contradiction. Some scholars argue that medieval discomfort with mirrors stemmed from their ability to show not just appearance, but posture, gesture, a slouch, a glance, a turn of the mouth that betrayed anxiety. In short, mirrors revealed more than faces. They revealed mood. And in a deeply hierarchical world, where everyone was meant to play their part, peasant, servant, knight, daughter, reflection that captured uncertainty was unsettling, especially when no one else was there to witness it but you. The disturbance of self in a quiet world. Remember, medieval homes were often quiet. No hum of electricity, no ambient streetlight. Rooms weren't filled with bookshelves or wall hangings unless you were among the elite. The average space was spare. Wood, wool, a candle, a stool. In that environment, anything reflective stood out aggressively. Even a small mirror, a palm-sized bit of polished bronze, could turn a corner into a moment of introspection. You weren't meant to stare at yourself for long. It was seen as vain, yes, but also provocative. This was especially true in evening hours, when everything slowed. Meals were finished, chores done, people moved less, talked less, and in that lull, a reflective surface became an invitation to look, yes, but also to be looked through. It's telling that in several monastic traditions, novices were instructed to cover all reflective surfaces in their chambers before compline, the final prayer of the night. not because they were distracted by them, but because there was a belief that the mind may wander when it sees itself alone. That phrase, sees itself alone, recurs again in multiple monastic texts. It suggests that solitude plus reflection was a psychological burden, a risk. You might think too much, or worse, you might feel too much. In a world that valued spiritual discipline and outward obedience, the mirror was a temptation not to sin, but to self-awareness, and that, perhaps, was the greatest threat of all. In shadows, the familiar becomes strange. So, what happened when someone ignored all this? When a mirror was left uncovered overnight in a quiet home? Usually, nothing. But stories persisted that a merchant's wife in Rouen reportedly covered her mirror after noticing her candle flickering in the reflection before it flickered in real life. A novice monk in Bohemia turned his shaving mirror toward the wall after seeing a face blink that wasn't his. A laundress in York claimed she once saw a second version of her own room in the glass. Same hearth, same cot, but the fire was out, and someone was sleeping in her place. These weren't ghost stories. They weren't meant to scare. They were shared more like warnings. Gentle ones. Cautionary. Because in the medieval imagination, the strange didn't shout. It whispered. It sat quietly until noticed. And then it stared back. And so the habit endured. Tilt the mirror. Tie the cloth. Don't look after dusk. Not because harm would follow, but because there are some moments of stillness that reveal more than anyone asked to see. If a medieval household had a basin or a small indoor cistern, there was one near universal habit. It was never left uncovered after dusk. Not just to keep insects out, not to prevent spills, but because water that didn't move, especially in silence, invited the wrong kind of attention. In monasteries, travelers' inns, merchant houses, and even modest farm dwellings, vessels that held water, ceramic bowls, stone troughs, tin wash basins, were typically emptied or covered with a board, cloth, or lid before nightfall. If a vessel couldn't be emptied, it was at least hidden behind a screen, placed in a shadow, or tilted slightly to avoid showing a smooth surface. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about stillness. Medieval people weren't afraid of water. They drank it, washed in it, blessed it. But they were uncomfortable with water that behaved unnaturally. Water that didn't flow, that sat, that reflected. Because in that motionless mirror, people often saw too much. The surface that washed back from 13th century Florence to 15th century Norwich. There are scattered accounts, almost always, in private letters, household records, or oral tradition, of people catching glimpses in standing water that didn't match what was in the room. Not horrifying things, not monsters, but small details that were wrong. A flicker from the wrong direction, a shadow that didn't move, a piece of furniture turned the other way. In the wash basin, you could see the rafters above your head, but one beam was missing. Then you looked up, and it was there. That slight dissonance unnerved people, not because they thought the water was cursed, but because it introduced doubt. Doubt about what was real, about what belonged. In an age when certainty was precious and reality was defined by routine, anything that made someone hesitate or question their surroundings became quietly taboo. Reflections with no source. A noblewoman from Flanders wrote in a letter to her cousin, "I do not wash in the late hour anymore. My water showed candlelight though my taper was spent." That detail, light appearing in still water where there was none nearby, shows up in multiple regions, almost always without fanfare. Not as a ghost story, just a remark, a reason to shift, a habit, a cause for a new household ruled. In one London household ledger from 1391, a line was added beneath the kitchen instructions. Basin to be covered after supper, lest it show the room wrongly. That phrase, show the room wrongly, is key. People didn't fear water for its own sake. They feared misrepresentation, a warped echo, a duplication that suggested their world wasn't as stable as it seemed. Mirrors did this in a focused way. But still water, especially poorly lit, imperfect water, was worse. Because it hinted at a parallel that wasn't clean-cut, something that blurred, and in blurring, invited interpretation. Or intrusion. Echoes in the dark corners. Unlike decorative mirrors, which were expensive and rare, still water was everywhere. That made it more dangerous, not in a physical sense, but emotionally. Psychologically, you couldn't avoid seeing your reflection while pouring from a cistern. You couldn't help but glance into a pail of rainwater, a trough in the stable, a bowl in the corner of a servant's quarters. And if that water sat too long, if no one stirred it, drained it, or dipped a hand into it, it gained a quality medieval people had no vocabulary for. Something like memory, or echo. This wasn't an official belief. No bishop banned basins. No town council declared still water an omen. But the customs were strikingly consistent. Don't keep water in sleeping chambers overnight. Don't leave bowls under open windows after dusk. Don't wash by candlelight. If you must keep water near the hearth, cover it. And above all, don't look too long. Because even if nothing appeared, even if the reflection matched perfectly, the act of looking pulled you away from the moment. And that distance, that separation from your grounded routine, made people feel off, vulnerable, exposed. That a reflection was never just yours. Some scholars argue that the fear of still water at night stemmed from dreams. People who stared into it often reported troubled sleep. Others connect it to ancient Roman beliefs, echoes of the idea that pools were entrances to other realms. But most likely, the discomfort came from the same root as the unease with mirrors. Medieval people weren't comfortable being observed by their own image, especially not when they were alone, especially not in the silence, because a reflection, once noticed, felt like company, uninvited company. And in a world where walls were thin, light was precious, and belief blurred into habit, that uninvited presence was enough to change how people lived at us. Oh, they made small changes. Shift the bowl, drape the cloth, pour the water outside, and they told their children not to stare, not because they'd see a ghost, but because they might see themselves in a moment that wasn't fully theirs, and that might stay with them longer than it should. In a time before plumbing, before glass as we know it, before the artificial sharpness of light bulbs and backlit screens, water had a presence. It wasn't just a tool. It wasn't decoration. It was a substance that responded to your nearness, your breath, your sound. And in the middle of the night, in a dimly lit room with a flickering tallow candle, that responsiveness could feel a little too alive. Medieval people were not strangers to hardship. They faced disease, war, superstition, hunger, and the dark in forms most of us today can't imagine. And yet, some of their deepest unease came not from obvious danger, but from ambiguity, from things that didn't act quite right, from materials that, under certain conditions, behaved like witnesses. Still water at night was one of those things. The household rituals around water throughout Europe, written records, oral traditions, and domestic practices all suggest the same thing. Still water was fine by day, but by night, it needed to be silenced. That meant covering, draining, tipping, or in some cases, hiding it altogether. In a 14th century ledger from a manorial household near Bruges, one servant's nightly duties included turning over all unused basins, washing buckets, and even emptying dog troughs. The water must not lie overnight, it read, else the dreams will not settle. That last line, the dreams will not settle, has been the subject of more than one historian's speculation. It might sound superstitious or poetic, but it reflects a very practical concern: poor sleep. People noticed that when water was left uncovered indoors, sleep quality declined. Not always dramatically, but often enough that habits changed. Even small households adopted routines like draping rough linen over buckets and placing wooden lids atop storage barrels. In some abbeys, novices were forbidden from washing their faces by candlelight after Compline, the final night prayer, not out of religious restriction, but because the distorted image in the basin could be unsettling to the soul. Reflections that didn't follow the rules. Water doesn't reflect like a mirror. It warps, it waves, it reacts to breath and sound. In firelight, the image it gives is always unstable. For most of the day, this wasn't a problem. But at night, when quiet reigned and other stimuli were reduced, this instability became obvious. Imagine a woman getting up from her straw mattress to check on a crying child. She passes a ceramic bowl used for washing earlier that evening. There's just a thin layer of water left. As she moves, the surface ripples, and for a moment, she sees a figure. Not a distinct one, just enough of a distortion that she pauses. A suggestion of motion where there shouldn't be any. She knows it's just light, just her own shape, but the feeling lingers to the next night. She covers the bowl. This experience wasn't unique. In fact, it became so widespread that a few noble households began commissioning bowls with lids, not for hygiene, but to avoid accidental glimpses. One such item, found in a 15th century manor in Poitiers, bore an inscription etched into the underside of the lid: "Close thyself by night, that the house may rest." Even communal bathhouses sometimes adopted this idea. In the town of Nordlingen, Germany, a 1432 ordinance requested that public bath basins be drained after use, not for sanitary reasons, but because idle water keeps restless thoughts. Water as a listener beyond reflecting. Still water had another unsettling quality. It listened. Now, obviously water can't hear. But imagine the medieval mind, surrounded by creaking timbers, moaning wind, animal calls, and human breath. In that soundscape, water that gently moved or rippled without provocation could feel reactive, interactive, like it was acknowledging something. And so people spoke differently around it. One monk's journal from a Welsh priory records: "Brother, Mathus will not pray beside the washing tub after matins." He says the words fall back into him. Another entry from a town doctor in Lübeck notes a patient complaining of being washed from the basin during a long illness. The patient wasn't delirious. He simply felt unsettled whenever he looked toward the bowl beside his cot. Became common to treat still water as something that required containment, not just physically, but emotionally. You didn't argue near it. You didn't cry near it. And you definitely didn't leave it sitting out at night to reflect the moonlight, because moonlit water had its own set of warnings in Breton coastal villages. It was said that moonlight in a basin invited the old tide, a phrase meaning a return of memory or grief. In inland regions, people spoke of shadow doubling, when your own silhouette might echo back to you from a basin but feel off. Scientific explanation? Or something else? Modern scholars have tried to explain these fears in psychological terms. A common theory suggests that the anxiety around still water was a projection of internal instability. In a world with so few ways to express emotional distress, people externalized it onto materials that seemed responsive. Another possibility is that firelight and fatigue created mild visual distortions that were interpreted as spiritual or ominous. In low light, our brains misread information. Combine that with exhaustion, superstition, and the profound stillness of medieval nights, and it's easy to see how a bowl of water could become a doorway, a threat, or a messenger. But the truth is, medieval people didn't need explanations. They had patterns. If enough people noticed the same thing, if a certain object led to disrupted sleep or strange moods, it was handled through practice, not theory. You didn't need to know why the basin made you uneasy. You just didn't look at it. You poured it out. A final glance. Even today, when most of us don't think twice about reflections, there's something deeply human about the idea that a quiet, unmoving surface might hold more than it shows. Maybe it doesn't need to be supernatural. Maybe it's just the feeling that, in that thin sheen of water, the room is watching back night after night. medieval families kept the water covered, not because they feared curses, but because in the still, breathing dark, stillness itself could feel like a question. And if you've lived through enough long winters, small illnesses, or strange dreams, you learn that some questions are better left unanswered. In the medieval home, the idea of seeing oneself was not tied to self-care or beauty as it is today. Mirrors were not standard furnishings, nor were they readily available to most people. Glassmaking was expensive, silvering even more so, and any polished surface capable of reflecting a face clearly was both rare and delicate. But where they did exist, small hand mirrors owned by the wealthy, bronze-polished discs in noble chambers, or even natural reflections from polished metal, the rules were surprisingly consistent across cultures and centuries. Keep them covered, turned inward, or out of sight after dusk. Not because mirrors were thought to contain demons, although that belief did appear in later superstitions, but because reflections at night behaved too much like things that noticed. The untrustworthy faced medieval people had a strong relationship with familiarity. They trusted what they recognized, be it sound, space, or gesture. And a mirror at night, under firelight, often presented a warped or unstable version of the self. The face looked back, but didn't quite belong. Unlike the smooth, high-contrast mirrors of the modern age, polished medieval mirrors blurred detail and deepened shadows. Light sources, candles, oil lamps, hearth fires, cast dancing flames that made the image shimmer, blink, or seem to shift. In the dark, with only a few flickering lumens, a face might appear older, or sadder, or even slightly. Forendata scribe in 13th century Florence wrote about briefly glimpsing his own reflection in a polished copper plate. He described the moment as being regarded by a twin who does not share your day. The rules of night. Many noble households had explicit rules for mirrors. Small glass or metal mirrors were often stored in leather pouches or velvet bags when not in use. Some were hung by straps near windows to catch morning light, but were turned to face the wall before nightfall. In England, a few inventories from the 1400s list mirror shrouds among a lady's personal effects, simple cloth coverings, sometimes embroidered with blessings or phrases like "hold no image after dusk." This wasn't considered superstition, per se. It was practice, a matter of quiet caution. Just as still water should not be left to lie, reflective surfaces should not remain visible once the day ended. In German townhouses, mirrors were sometimes stored inside wall cupboards, not for theft, prevention, but to keep them from opening the house to unneeded faces. As one housewife's manual advised, that it might sound odd, but this practice even extended to non-reflective materials. Anything with the potential to mimic shiny pans, decorative metal, certain types of burnished ceramics was either moved or covered in the evening. The logic was simple. Night is a time for stillness, not repetition. Reflection as invitation. Why were medieval people so wary of nighttime reflections? There's no single answer, but scattered writings suggest that the concern was not just what one saw, but what seeing might allow. One recurring belief, mentioned in both noble letters and oral stories, was that mirrors open a space, that looking into one at night could invite something else to look back. Again, this wasn't framed in religious terms. No devils, no curses, just a quiet sense that attention flows both ways. That a minor noblewoman in Normandy wrote in a private letter that her sleep was disturbed for nights after accidentally catching her own reflection in a shaving mirror left uncovered in her husband's room. He was not there, she wrote, and yet someone else was. The sensation wasn't terror. It was displacement, a subtle wrongness. And in a world where people clung to routine and expected consistency from their physical surroundings, even a small disruption could unsettle the entire household. Architectural reinforcement. This anxiety influenced how homes were built. Mirrors were rarely placed near sleeping quarters. If present at all, They stayed in dressing rooms or daylight areas. In monastic cells, metal polished enough to reflect was discouraged altogether. When mirrors were necessary for grooming or care, their use was ritualized, always by day, and always returned to a drawer or covered cloth afterward. Interestingly, some buildings included intentional blind corners, niches, and alcoves. That discouraged internal reflections. While we don't have explicit documentation saying these were designed for that purpose, the architectural patterns align closely with households known for more reflective objects. The idea, perhaps, was to ensure that no surface caught you unawares after sundown. Still water and the mirror's cousin, the caution around mirrors, wasn't isolated. It mirrored, pun intended, the same unease people had with still water. In fact, there's evidence that both were often treated similarly. In folklore collected in the 14th and 15th centuries, a basin left out and a mirror left uncovered are sometimes mentioned in the same breath. Two open eyes invite a third, goes one Italian countryside phrase, just as night water could ripple at nothing and seem to respond. So too could the surface of a mirror seem to quiver in candlelight. And while no one believed the objects were alive, they still treated them as receptive. Like blank parchment, something that could absorb emotion, attention, even misfortune, sleep, dreams, and reflections. Most of these practices centered on sleep. Night was the most vulnerable time, and if you woke unexpectedly, whether from a dream, pain, cold, or a child's call, the last thing you wanted was to see a face that wasn't behaving correctly. There are multiple records of disturbed dreams that begin with something in the mirror or a face in the basin. These weren't considered omens, but they were taken seriously. People adjusted their rooms, changed their routines, just in case. One curious example comes from a merchant's home in 14th century Prague. The family's daughter had trouble sleeping for weeks. Eventually, the household realized that her bed was angled to face a small silver mirror hung near the window. After removing it, her sleep improved. No one drew mystical conclusions, but the change became permanent. One caretaker wrote, "The face we carry all day should rest with us, not wake beside us. Not fear, but boundary. It's important to understand. These behaviors weren't always based in fear. More often, they reflected a culture of limits. The night was not infinite. It was structured by oil, wood, warmth, and walls. And within those limits, people learned to respect what didn't behave as expected. Still water and mirrors were materials of motion, of responsiveness. And at night, responsiveness could feel invasive. So households covered what reflected, emptied what shimmered, and returned to sleep without the weight of unintended eyes. By the end of the 15th century, something began to change inside the medieval household. Not overnight, not loudly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a single invention, decree, or revolution that shifted things, but a combination of small transformations. Candles burned longer. Glass became clearer. Mirrors lost their rarity. And with each change, the old rules, the unspoken boundaries around reflections and still water, began to loosen. What was once unquestioned habits slowly became optional. And then, for some, unnecessary. But this shift didn't happen without resistance. In fact, for several generations, it was exactly the homes that had access to new luxuries, larger mirrors, polished bowls, glass surfaces, that clung most tightly to the old habits. Because as reflections became easier to see, they also became harder to dismiss. The arrival of clarity, one of the quiet revolutions of the late medieval period, was in glassmaking. By the late 1400s, improved techniques in Venice and Flanders allowed for thinner, more reflective panes, especially when paired with silver or mercury backing. For the first time, a person could see a close approximation of their own face, not a ghostly smear, not a suggestion, but an actual mirror image. This was a marvel and a threat. Because the uncertainty of earlier reflections had protected people, the distortions created distance. The mind could accept that the shimmering face wasn't quite its own. But when mirrors became accurate, the illusion became convincing. And that's when discomfort deepened. Suddenly, a face glanced in passing wasn't strange. It was familiar, recognizable, specific. And at night, that was worse. Many households began creating new forms of mirror covers, some with drawstring cloths, others with wooden shutters, even some elaborate cabinet systems that allowed the mirror to rotate inward at night, revealing only polished wood. These weren't leftovers of superstition. They were new responses to new clarity, because the fear was never just about the reflection. It was about what the reflection meant, the changing tone of still water. A similar shift occurred around indoor water. As piped systems and fountains began to appear in some wealthier homes, the idea of intentionally bringing still water indoors became practical rather than accidental. Basins were no longer just for morning ablutions or midday cooking. They began to serve decorative and symbolic purposes. But the old caution remained, and people navigated this tension carefully. In many inventories from northern Italy and southern France, fountain bowls in courtyards were covered with lids at night. House stewards were given explicit instruction: drain the water before dusk. Let no surface remain smooth after sundown. Point 1. Florence Merchant's manual for household staff even included this phrasing: if it holds a face at night, it holds too much. Still, there were countercurrents. Philosophers, particularly those influenced by Arabic and Greek translations being reintroduced into Europe, began to question why reflection inspired caution. Writings from scholars in Paris, Toledo, and Bologna argued that the fear of reflected surfaces was a vestige of older folk thinking, not fit for the modern mind. They weren't entirely wrong. But in dismissing the practice, they overlooked something crucial. These habits weren't only about fear. They were about control. Mirrors in motion. As Renaissance thinking took hold, mirrors stopped being hidden. They became statements, objects of luxury and learning. Mirrors were placed not just in bedrooms, but in libraries, entry halls, salons. In some cases, they were even paired with still water, positioned above wash basins or in front of interior fountains. But this visibility came with friction. Letters and journals from this transitional period, especially among the literate upper classes, frequently mention night unease in rooms with too many surfaces. People couldn't explain the discomfort. They simply slept poorly, or described having odd dreams, or felt watched. A few still placed linen cloths over mirrors without saying why. In London, an aristocrat's diary from 1498 describes removing a mirror from the bedroom because my wife said her thoughts reflected strangely. He made no moral judgment, only noted it helped them sleep. Some architects even adjusted for these tensions. In certain noble homes built during this time, large decorative mirrors were affixed with hinges, not for mobility, but so they could be turned to the wall at night. The tradition wasn't dead. It was evolving. The blurring of utility and ritual as the medieval period gave way to early modernity. The line between superstition and ritualized habit blurred even further. No longer enforced by social consensus, reflection rules became personal. Choices, some kept them. Others didn't. A monk in Bavaria kept his bronze mirror in a locked chest and only used it in full daylight. A wealthy widow in Florence installed mirrored panels in her drawing room, but had her maid draw curtains across them before evening guests arrived. Meanwhile, merchants in Prague sold polished dishes and still water basins specifically labeled as night calming, a nod to older fears, now repackaged as luxury. Even the church took note. While religious institutions rarely commented on mirror etiquette directly, records show that many monasteries and convents prohibited reflective surfaces in sleeping quarters until the 17th century. The reason cited? To prevent distractions. of the mind. It's telling that the word distraction was used. Not evil, not danger, just disturbance. Because at the heart of it all, the medieval discomfort with reflections wasn't about malevolence. It was about misalignment. A mirror that showed your face when you didn't ask. Water that rippled when no one moved. These weren't threats. They were reminders that not everything still was safe, that a legacy that lingers today. We leave mirrors uncovered. We fill rooms with glass. We sleep beside reflective black screens and bathe in porcelain tubs that gleam like silver. Yet even now, the old instincts flicker. Some people still feel uneasy passing a mirror at night. Some still drain the sink without knowing why. Hotels place mirrors in corners, not across beds. Some cultures still drape a cloth over a reflective surface after a death, not because of ghosts, but because stillness is sacred. And in that, the medieval mind might still nod in agreement, because what they feared or respected was never the object. It was the invitation, the silent question in every surface that could look back. Who is watching whom? As the final decades of the medieval era unfolded, a quiet contradiction began settling into domestic life. People were living with more clarity than ever before. Glass was clearer, surfaces smoother, and homes increasingly structured to welcome light. Yet despite this newfound visibility, there remained a strange unease that settled especially at night. Mirrors were no longer rare, yet they were still often covered. Water was piped or stored with greater convenience, yet still carefully poured out before bedtime. Even as the rationale for these old practices faded from formal discourse, the habits persisted, sometimes silently, sometimes stubbornly, and occasionally even unknowingly. This enduring friction between the visible and the invisible, the seen and the almost seen, would define the closing centuries of what we now call the Middle Ages that in larger towns and cities, particularly those flourishing in trade, polished. Surfaces became symbols of status. A merchant in Bruges might have a decorative mirror embedded in his parlor wall. A goldsmith in Florence might commission a reflective basin for his studio. But at the same time, you could read in these men's household logs that the mirror was kept behind a cloth shutter at night, or that the basin was emptied and dried after sundown. These were not declarations of fear, but habits rooted in something deeper. Call it residual caution, ancestral rhythm, or just a cultural muscle memory that refused to weaken. The rationale no longer needed articulation. The practice itself carried its own momentum. This quiet persistence is perhaps most evident in how people wrote about their own discomfort. In letters and journals from the late 15th to early 16th centuries, we begin to see reflections mentioned not with dread, but with a kind of resigned acknowledgement. One nobleman from Burgundy wrote to his cousin that he had moved a silver mirror from his sleeping chamber to the library, noting, "I find I think more freely by day and sleep more soundly by night." Another account from a scribe in Milan describes how he covered the surface of his writing basin each evening to keep the thoughts in it still. These phrases weren't rooted in theology or folklore anymore. They were almost poetic, except that no one was writing poetry. These were practical men, speaking plainly, simply stating that reflective surfaces changed their mental state after dark. That it is worth noting, however, that rural communities held on to these practices with even more consistency. In farmsteads and isolated manors, especially in the northern territories of Europe, the rules around reflection remained not just practical, but almost sacred. A common refrain among aging matriarchs in these villages was that no face should float while the fire is low. That is, no mirrored or watery reflection should remain visible after the household fire had dimmed to embers. These instructions were passed not as superstition, but as household order, alongside how to store grain or mend a thatched roof. Some of these women likely didn't know why the rule existed, but they kept it. Meanwhile, children growing up in These homes came to understand certain rituals with the weight of inevitability. Mirrors were cleaned only during daylight. Wash basins were stored upside down after use. Rain buckets were emptied before nightfall, lest they reflect moonlight through a window and catch someone's eye. These weren't dramatic gestures. They were small, deliberate actions carried out in silence. The kinds of routines that rarely get written down and yet define an entire worldview. What's particularly fascinating is how these quiet rituals began to create subtle architectural cues. Builders who designed homes for wealthy patrons began to embed mirrors into alcoves, allowing them to be discreetly hidden behind panels. Wash basins were integrated into wooden cabinets with lids that could be fastened closed. In wealthier cities, bedroom design shifted so that no mirror directly faced a sleeping area. In some rare cases, fireplaces were even flanked with mirrored panels that could be covered with sliding shutters at dusk. These weren't necessarily features requested by the patrons. They were often the innovations of builders and carpenters, who had inherited a sense of propriety around how reflective surfaces should behave. And yet, not everyone agreed. In academic circles, particularly among those influenced by Renaissance humanism, the older caution was seen as provincial or regressive. Philosophers and scientists began arguing that the unease around mirrors and still water was irrational, a remnant of darker, less enlightened times. They pointed to ancient Roman use of polished surfaces, to Arab mathematicians' calculations of light and vision, to the rebirth of classical understanding. But even among these thinkers, there are letters, private, notes that admit to discomfort. One physician in Toulouse, known for his lectures on optics, confessed in his personal diary that he kept a cloth over the basin in his guest room, not for reason, but for rest. And that is the paradox of this entire phenomenon. Even those who dismissed it often still practiced it. Because unease does not require a theory to justify it. Over time, of course, these customs softened. By the mid-16th century, open mirrors were more common in homes, especially in urban centers. Basins remained uncovered, and yet, even then, small echoes of the old discomfort lingered. A sleeping chamber might contain a mirror, but its owner might place a book in front of it before turning in. A basin might sit full of water overnight, but tucked under a tablecloth or in a corner far from firelight. These gestures might appear trivial to an outsider, but to the person living in the space, they made all the difference between sleep and unsettled rest. What does all of this tell us? That while the medieval era's caution around reflection began as a cultural practice, deepened by limited light, structural design, and environmental awareness, it eventually became something more personal, more internalized. It became about atmosphere, emotional equilibrium, the desire to curate one's space, not just visually, but mentally. A room without uncontrolled surfaces felt safer, not because anything would happen, but because nothing unexpected would. And in this, perhaps, we understand the medieval mind a little more clearly. Their avoidance of mirrors and still water at night was never just about superstition. It was about boundaries, about ensuring that the space where you lay your head was wholly yours, not shared with accidental echoes or silent watchers. Reflection, in this view, was not just an image, it was a visitor, one you didn't invite, one you didn't want lingering once the fire died out and the silence pressed in. Even today, when we pass by a mirror in a dark hallway and quicken our step without thinking, we are echoing something ancient. Not fear, but recognition. That, somewhere deep inside us, is a sense that not all things that reflect are passive, and not all stillness is innocent. In the medieval home, that knowledge wasn't suppressed. It was respected, ritualized, integrated. And while time has softened the sharpness of that instinct, it hasn't erased it entirely. It waits in the dark corners of our most familiar spaces, in the shimmer of a night black screen, in the curve of a faucet just before we sleep. In the bowl of water we never meant to leave out a reminder. Reflections are not just seen, they are shared, and the medieval world never forgot that. As medieval life trudged forward, slower than the turning of clocks but steadier than rumor, people learned to live with stillness not just as absence, but as presence. Silence in the medieval home was rarely empty. It was layered, weighted. It carried the memory of sound that had just faded or the tension of something about to happen. And in this quiet, objects began to adopt presence too, particularly those that washed without seeming to. Mirrors, pools, polished copper, water that didn't ripple. They didn't move, didn't speak, but they held on to what had passed. Or at least, people acted like they did, which, in daily life, amounts to the same thing. One curious thing about medieval reflection culture is how closely it became tied to memory. Not formal, written memory, like chronicles or family records, but emotional memory. Moments people wanted to forget were often described in terms of reflection. You'll find this in private letters, in scribbled margins of books, in the muttered accounts of trial witnesses. She looked into the bowl and saw the hour again. The fire burned behind my shoulder and showed me as I had been. These weren't poetic exaggerations, they were experiential. Medieval people often described mirrors or water not just as reflecting space, but as catching mood, echoing emotion. It's not that they thought the objects stored these feelings like magical artifacts. It's that they themselves projected memory onto reflective surfaces, sometimes unconsciously. This belief didn't emerge from nowhere. Part of it came from how rare reflection was. There were no bathroom mirrors in every home, no windows with neat glass panes, no flat TV screens to catch movement in the background. Reflection, when it happened, was an event. If you caught your face in the copper pot or saw your shadow ripple in the water barrel, that was a moment you noticed. And in that moment, something more than just your image surfaced. You were seeing yourself at a particular time, in a particular light, with a particular thought. And if that thought was heavy, the reflection might come to belong to that feeling. This association deepened around grief. In households that experienced loss, especially sudden loss, mirrors were often turned, covered, or removed altogether. Not for superstition, but because no one wanted to catch a glimpse of the room as it used to be. No one wanted to see where someone had stood yesterday. Grief made reflective surfaces unbearable. They didn't lie, and that honesty, on a quiet night, could be too much to eye in. One particularly telling letter from a widowed farmer's daughter in 1482, she wrote to her sister, "I keep the mirror covered, not because I fear him, but because he is not there." That sentence captures something deeply medieval, the tension between absence and memory, and the role objects played in forcing one to reconcile the two. Her reflection didn't scare her. What scared her was its emptiness, the way it failed to contain what had been real just days before. Because of these emotional ties, reflection became quietly ceremonial. Even households that did not practice much in the way of religion often observed personal customs around reflective objects. One household journal from the Black Forest records the daily routine of covering the water basin after the evening wash, not with urgency, but with respect. "It is done," the entry notes, "to return the room to itself." Another account, from a baker's apprentice in Utrecht, mentions how his master placed a ceramic tile over the polished copper lid of their flour bin after nightfall, even though the lid reflected very little. When asked why, the baker simply said, "Eyes do not belong in sleep." These habits weren't about fearing ghosts or spirits. By the 15th century, much of the Western European population, especially the literate class, didn't frame their nightly actions around supernatural threats. Instead, their caution around reflections was about containment, the desire to leave the day where it was, and not let it carry into the fragile space of rest. Because sleep, in the medieval mind, was not just rest. It was a kind of departure, and you didn't want anything lingering behind you, holding your image in its quiet surface as you left. Even public buildings adhered to this impulse. In guild halls and town meeting spaces, mirrored or polished items were stored after use. Water was dumped, not because anyone demanded it, but because over time, people had come to understand that reflective surfaces pulled focus, distracted, invited mood. In environments that needed decisions and clarity, mirrors had no place. In fact, in several early civic planning documents from Prague and Flanders, interior designers were advised to use unbroken wood or stone without shimmer. There was even a term in certain construction circles, quiet walls, which referred to surfaces that absorbed light and gave nothing back. These preferences extended even to travel. Merchants, traders, pilgrims, they often carried polished items for function, like shaving mirrors or metal bowls, but they stored them in cloth, leather, or wooden boxes. These weren't fragile items, but they were hidden nonetheless. The notion of accidentally catching one's own reflection on a road or in a forest clearing seemed to bother many travelers more than the actual dangers of the path. A 1496 travel log from a Venetian spice merchant notes, "I saw my eyes in the pot's curve, and for a moment thought I was not myself." That disorientation, that momentary split between image and identity, was enough to make men wary. What modern minds might struggle to grasp is how calm all of this was. These weren't dramatized rituals. They weren't loud proclamations. They were quiet, habitual, deeply integrated into daily life. You might live your entire life observing these small customs and never articulate why. You just knew the mirror needed to be turned. The bowl needed to be emptied. The lamp should not face the window. And perhaps that is the most telling thing. That in an era of survival and simplicity, where life was often reduced to practical concerns, people still made space for something unspoken. They didn't need reasons. They needed rhythm. And reflection, visual, emotional, temporal, had its place in that rhythm. As the medieval world transitioned into early modernity, much of this subtle choreography began to fade. Mirrors became more common, more decorative. Basins remained, but the rituals around them softened. And yet, even now, echoes of these habits persist. Some people still cover mirrors when grieving. Others feel uncomfortable walking past a darkened window at night. A bowl of water left out too long can feel wrong. Not dirty, just off. We don't always know why we do what we do, but we carry memory in our behaviors, not just in our minds. The medieval caution around reflection wasn't fear. It was awareness, an acknowledgement that what looks back at you isn't always just your face. Sometimes, it's the shape of the day, or the echo of a thought, or the version of yourself you meant to leave behind. And when night comes, and the world narrows to a room, a chair, a flickering candle, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is turn the mirror to the wall, tip the basin dry, and let the silence be your only companion, because not all light is helpful, and not all stillness is empty. By the late medieval period, a strange duality had settled into the everyday handling of reflective surfaces. On the one hand, people clearly acknowledged that mirrors, polished metal, and still water could serve useful purposes: grooming, craftsmanship, cooking, even communication in some rare monastic rituals. But on the other hand, there was an unspoken consensus that one should not look unless there was a reason. The act of looking into a mirror, a bowl, a pane of darkened glass had become an intentional gesture. You didn't do it casually. You didn't do it often. And if you were caught looking too long, others might question why. This social expectation didn't need to be codified. It didn't appear in written law or church doctrine, though some sermons loosely touched on the dangers of vanity. It survived because it was passed in glances, gestures, and subtle corrections. A boy staring into a puddle too long might be told, "You'll find nothing new down there." A girl brushing her hair before an unshuttered window might be asked, "Do you want something to see you?" These weren't superstitious threats. They were boundary reminders. People believed in the importance of being selective about when and how they looked at themselves. That what's striking is how this attitude fed directly into the architecture and layout of medieval homes. Spaces were deliberately structured to minimize passive reflection. Polished surfaces were kept low, angled, or boxed. Windows were placed to allow light in, but not necessarily to allow people to see themselves. And where natural reflection did occur, say, in a basin set under a window or a puddle that formed in a stone courtyard, it was either ignored or actively disrupted. Some households made a point of disturbing standing water at dusk, not draining it necessarily, just enough movement to break the reflection. This habit has been noted in multiple household journals and estate inventories from the 14th and 15th centuries. In one Scottish ledger, there's an entry describing the evening routine, all still water checked and stirred. Metalware returned to box. Curtain dropped across the looking glass in the upstairs chamber. None of this was framed as protection from spirits or curses. It was maintenance, like checking the fire or closing the gate. You were maintaining not just physical space, but mental stillness. Reflective surfaces, left unattended, had the power to draw attention inward, and not always helpfully. This wasn't about fear of what you might see. It was about fear of being pulled away from your environment, of becoming too internal. And for a world so dependent on external cues, bells, light, footsteps, the rhythm of others, turning inward at the wrong time could be isolating, even dangerous. This is why the practice of limiting reflective exposure was most strictly observed during illness, grief, or emotional distress. In those states, people were already vulnerable to detachment. Seeing oneself unexpectedly or for too long could unmoor the mind. One physician's manual from 1391 explicitly advises, in fever or confusion, remove all looking things from the room. The recommendation wasn't medical in the modern sense, it was psychological or what passed for it at the time. Reflection was thought to create instability, not because it distorted reality, but because it made the self seem separate from the body. And to people without access to modern concepts of dissociation, this was deeply unsettling. This idea that reflection caused a kind of temporary split in awareness was especially prevalent in the writings of cloistered communities. While religious, interpretation isn't the focus here. It's worth noting that monks and nuns often recorded how they avoided mirrors rather than why. Their reasoning was usually phrased as humility, but their behavior aligned closely with broader lay traditions. Covered mirrors, bowls turned upside down. Even ornate items like chalices were stored so that their polish faced inward. In households outside the cloister, the avoidance was less ceremonial but no less consistent. You'll find record after record of reflective surfaces being rotated, hidden, or dulled. Brass items were polished only when needed, and then dulled again with wax or cloth when not. Silver was rarely left bare. People didn't fear mirrors. They simply treated them as unstable, unpredictable, something to engage with intentionally, not passively. What modern minds often miss is that this wasn't just about avoiding discomfort. It was also about preserving authority over one's own image. In a time when most people had few or no depictions of themselves, no paintings, no photographs, no way to see themselves except through reflection, controlling when and how you saw yourself was a form of power. If you only glimpsed your face when washing, or once a week when preparing for market, then that moment mattered. You chose it. And because of that choice, your sense of self remained anchored in memory, not in constant visual feedback. This also meant that reflections from unexpected sources, say, catching your face in a puddle or seeing yourself in a stranger's shiny blade, were jarring. Not frightening, necessarily, but intrusive. You hadn't asked to see yourself. And in that unsolicited reflection, there was discomfort. Not just from the image, but from the timing. You didn't prepare to meet yourself just then, and perhaps that's the heart of it. In the medieval experience, to see oneself was an encounter, not a glance, not a tool, but a moment of confrontation, of recognition. And when life was governed so tightly by structure, routine, and social rhythm, encounters had weight. People didn't want that weight at the wrong hour, in the wrong place, with the wrong emotion riding their shoulders. That's why polished items were turned inward at night, why basins were emptied, why even shadows on a whitewashed wall were carefully obscured with draped cloth, not because they held evil, but because they held the possibility of a returning gaze, something that looked back, something that remembered, something that asked, wordlessly, silently, is this really you? And sometimes, especially at the end of a long, heavy day, the answer to that question was best left unspoken. In the medieval world, most fears weren't born from fantasy. They came from patterns, from generations observing what unsettled people, what disturbed rest, what left behind a residue of unease that couldn't quite be explained. Mirrors and still water weren't banned, nor condemned. They simply asked for more respect than the average object, because they had the power to echo back. And echoing, in a time when silence was precious, felt like too much noise. What mattered wasn't whether something supernatural lived inside the surface. It was that the surface responded. It showed you things. Sometimes your face. Sometimes your fatigue. Sometimes just how unfamiliar you looked when no one else was around. And in a life structured by the communal, shared meals, shared space, shared labor, those private recognitions could be disorienting. So people chose when to look. They kept polished things out of reach. They disturbed quiet reflections before bed, not from fear, but from understanding. Knowing that the self is something best met when you're ready. In the end, avoiding mirrors and still water indoors wasn't about superstition. It was about rhythm, control, protecting the balance of a world that was already fragile in so many other ways. Because when darkness fell and the house grew quiet, people didn't want more questions. They wanted stillness. They wanted sleep. And sleep came easiest when the world outside and the self within both stayed undisturbed.